I've been driving these roads for 32 years now, hauling freight across state lines while most of the world sleeps safe in their beds, dreaming dreams they'll forget by morning. There's a particular kind of loneliness that settles into your bones out here on the forgotten back roads at 3 in the morning. Not the sad kind that makes you reach for the phone, but something older, something that reminds you how small you really are. The highway stretches out like a dark river, and you're just drifting through it, watching the broken white lines disappear under your hood one after another, hypnotic and endless. Civilization becomes nothing more than a memory in your rearview mirror, a faint glow on the horizon that fades with every mile you put between yourself and the last truck stop. Out here, it's just you and the machine, the low rumble of the engine, and the vast emptiness pressing against your windows like it's trying to get in. The radio loses its signal first, dissolving into static and ghost voices that fade before you can make out the words. Then the cell towers thin out, and your phone becomes a useless brick of glass and metal in the cup holder. You start talking to yourself just to remember what your own voice sounds like, just to prove you're still real, still here, still moving through a world that suddenly feels like it might not care whether you exist or not. Sometimes I wonder if the road goes on forever, if I've been driving the same stretch over and over without realizing it, caught in some loop I can't see the edges of. That's the kind of thinking that creeps in when the darkness gets thick enough, when the only light comes from your own headlights, carving a tunnel through the void. And once that thinking starts, it's hard to shake off, hard to remember that morning always comes eventually, that the sun will rise and reveal the ordinary world again. Most nights blend together after a while, each one identical to the last. Same roads, same rest stops, same bitter coffee that tastes like it was brewed 3 days ago. You develop routines to keep yourself anchored, little rituals that mark the passage of time and distance. Check the mirrors every 30 seconds, adjust the thermostat, count the reflective posts along the shoulder. Anything to keep your mind from wandering too far into the spaces between thoughts. I've seen things out here that I wrote off as exhaustion. Tricks of the eye when you've been staring at darkness for too long without rest. Shadow shapes that dart across the road just beyond the reach of your headlights, gone before your brain can process what they might have been. Abandoned structures that appear suddenly beside the highway, buildings that don't match any architectural style you recognize, standing in places no one would ever build anything. You learn not to look too closely, not to wonder too much, because wondering leads to questions you can't answer, and questions without answers become weights you carry with you, getting heavier with each passing mile. The other drivers warn you about that when you're new to this life. They tell you to keep your eyes on the road, trust your instruments, and don't let the loneliness convince you that you're seeing things that aren't there. But they also get quiet sometimes, mid-conversation at the diners where we gather before dawn, and you catch them staring at nothing, remembering something they've decided not to share. Their eyes have a certain look, like they've glimpsed something through a crack in the world that they can't unsee, can't quite explain, and aren't sure they should try. I used to be like them, keeping my stories to myself, filing away the strange experiences under fatigue or overactive imagination, and moving on with the job. I told myself that the world made sense, that everything had a rational explanation if you looked hard enough, that mystery was just ignorance waiting to be solved by better information. That kind of certainty is comfortable, safe, a warm blanket you pull tight around your mind to keep out the cold wind of doubt. But certainty is also fragile, and it only takes one moment, one experience that refuses to fit into the neat boxes you've constructed to shatter it completely. When that happens, when you come face to face with something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught about reality, you have two choices. You can lie to yourself, or you can accept that the map of the world you've been carrying around in your head is missing some very important territories. I chose the second path, not because I'm brave, but because what I saw that night wouldn't let me forget, wouldn't let me pretend, wouldn't release me from the burden of knowing. And now, after years of silence, I'm ready to tell someone, to speak it out loud and let the weight of it pass into other hands. Because some stories demand to be told, and some truths won't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. It happened on a route I'd driven 100 times before, a straight shot that should have been simple, routine, forgettable like all the others. But the road had different plans that night, and I've learned since then that sometimes the road chooses you, not the other way around. Everything I thought I understood about this world, about the nature of existence itself, changed in the span of a few hours on a stretch of asphalt that doesn't appear on any map I've checked since. I've gone back looking for it, driven the same region dozens of times hoping to find that turnoff again, but it's like it was never there, like it only exists on certain nights for certain people, revealing itself according to rules I don't pretend to comprehend. What I encountered out there in the darkness between towns, between heartbeats, between one breath and the next, wasn't human, but it was aware. It was ancient, and it saw me just as clearly as I saw it. The memory burns in my mind with perfect clarity, every detail sharp and bright despite the years that have passed, and I carry a mark from that night that no one else can see, but that I feel every single day. This is my testimony, my confession, my attempt to make sense of an experience that defies sense. And if you're listening to these words, then maybe you're ready to hear what I've learned, that the world is stranger and more vast than we allow ourselves to believe, and that some roads lead to places that change you forever. The GPS had been glitching for about 20 miles, the screen flickering between static and impossible. Directions telling me to turn onto roads that didn't exist, recalculating over and over with increasing desperation. I'd been relying on memory and instinct, following the general direction I knew I needed to go. When the device finally gave up entirely and went dark, the screen reflecting my own tired face back at me like a black mirror. That's when I saw the turnoff, not marked on any sign, just a gap in the landscape where the darkness seemed slightly different, deeper somehow, like a crease in fabric where the material folds into itself. Something in my gut told me not to take it, that primal instinct we've inherited from ancestors who knew that strange paths often led to strange ends. But the rational part of my brain argued that it might be a shortcut, a local route that would get me back on track. The rational part won, the way it usually does, because we've trained ourselves to ignore those ancient whispers in favor of logic and convenience. I eased the rig onto that unnamed road, feeling the subtle change in the asphalt. Under my tires, a texture that seemed older somehow, like I'd driven from the present into some preserved pocket of the past. The headlights swept across landscape that looked wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The vegetation too uniform, the hills too symmetrical, the shadows falling at angles that didn't match the position of my lights. There were no reflectors along the shoulder, no painted lines dividing the lanes, no evidence that any municipal authority had ever maintained this stretch. It was road in the most primitive sense, a path carved through wilderness that had barely been tamed, and with every mile I travelled down it, the feeling grew stronger that I was crossing some invisible boundary, leaving behind the world I knew for something else entirely. The engine sounded different here, the familiar rumble taking on strange harmonics, as if the air itself had changed density. And when I checked the rearview mirror, the road behind me had already vanished into a wall of darkness, so complete it seemed solid. The silence hit me next, a profound absence of sound that made my ears ring with the pressure of it, like diving too deep underwater or climbing too high into thin atmosphere. Even the engine noise seemed muted, dampened, swallowed by something that wanted quiet, that demanded attention, be paid without the distraction of ordinary ambient sound. I realized I couldn't hear the tires on the pavement anymore, that strange whisper hiss that's been the constant soundtrack of my entire adult life, present even when I'm not consciously aware of it. The radio was dead, not static, but truly silent. And when I reached for my phone to check the time, I found it had somehow drained to zero. despite being fully charged less than an hour ago. Time itself felt unreliable here, elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made me uncertain whether I'd been driving this road for minutes or hours. My hands were gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white with tension I didn't fully understand yet, some part of me already recognizing danger before my conscious mind could name it. The road ahead seemed to narrow and widen in rhythm with my breathing. Or maybe I was breathing in rhythm with the road, falling into synchronization with something that had its own pulse, its own life. I found myself counting things, telephone poles that weren't there, exits I was passing. That didn't exist. Mile markers I couldn't see, creating structure where none existed because the human mind can't tolerate complete disorientation without fragmenting. The dashboard lights reflected off the windshield, creating a double image of the instruments, and I caught myself checking them obsessively, needing the confirmation that speed still meant something, that fuel still burned, that the physical laws I'd relied on for decades were still operating. But the gauges seemed hesitant, the needles trembling as if uncertain what truth they should report, and I wondered if I'd somehow driven beyond their ability to measure, entered a space where their calibrations no longer applied. That's when I saw it in the distance, a shape that resolved slowly from the darkness ahead, standing in the exact center of the road, with a stillness that was fundamentally wrong, fundamentally other. At first, my brain tried to make it familiar. A person, a deer, some ordinary obstacle that required ordinary responses. But as the headlights brought it into clearer focus, every attempt at categorization failed and fell away like scaffolding around something too vast to support. It was tall, much taller than any human had right to be. The proportions subtly incorrect in ways that made my eyes hurt, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew was possible. The figure didn't move as I approached, didn't turn or step aside or show any of the reactive behaviors that living things display when confronted with 2 tons of steel bearing down on them. It simply stood, waiting with the patience of stone, of mountains, of things that measure time in epochs rather than heartbeats. My foot found the brake without conscious instruction, some survival instinct taking over while my higher reasoning functions struggled to process the impossible data streaming in through my eyes. The truck began to slow, the deceleration smooth and dreamlike, and I had the strange sense that physics itself was being gentle with me, easing me into this moment rather than forcing the abrupt stop that should have happened. The headlights illuminated the figure fully now, and I felt something crack inside my chest, some barrier between what I believed and what was real, shattering like ice under sudden weight. This was not a person, not an animal, not anything that evolution as I understood it could have produced through natural selection and adaptation. This was something else entirely, something that belonged to a different category of existence, and as I sat there with my foot pressed hard against the brake pedal, engine idling in that muted underwater way, I understood with terrible clarity that I had driven beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world into a space where different rules applied, where different inhabitants walked roads that only appeared when they chose to be found. The figure turned toward me then, a movement so fluid it seemed to happen between moments rather than during them, as if it existed slightly out of sync with normal time, and I was seeing the results of its motion without witnessing the motion itself. Its face, if that word applies to what I saw, caught the headlights and reflected them back with a brightness that shouldn't have been possible, eyes that weren't quite eyes glowing with their own internal luminescence, ancient and knowing and utterly alien. The proportions were wrong in ways my mind kept trying to correct. Limbs too long and joints that bent at angles that made my stomach turn, a geometry that violated the basic template of vertebrate life I'd unconsciously assumed was universal. But despite the wrongness, despite every instinct screaming at me to look away, to reverse, to flee back toward the familiar world, I couldn't move, couldn't break. The eye contact that had formed between us like a bridge, like a doorway swinging open. In that gaze, I felt something ancient, recognizing something equally ancient within me, a connection that bypassed language and logic and went straight to whatever part of the human soul still remembers when we were prey animals, watching predators from the safety of caves, when the night held mysteries we hadn't yet named and couldn't control. This being wasn't just old, it was primordial, woven into the fabric of the world in ways that preceded human civilization, preceded human existence entirely, belonging to an order of reality we'd forgotten in our rush toward progress and electric lights and rational explanations. It stood there watching me with what might have been curiosity, might have been assessment, might have been something for which we have no corresponding emotion, and I realized with a mixture of terror and wonder that this encounter wasn't random, that I had been guided here, selected somehow, chosen for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend, but that felt as inevitable as gravity, as inescapable as my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The creature began to move toward the truck, not walking in any recognizable sense, but rather flowing through space as if distance itself was negotiable, a suggestion rather than a law. Each advance seemed to happen in the space between my blinks, covering yards in what should have been seconds, but felt stretched into small eternities. Time distorting around its presence like light bending near a massive gravitational field. I wanted to put the truck in reverse, to stomp on the accelerator and tear away from this impossibility, but my body had betrayed me, muscles locked. In a paralysis that was both physical and deeper than physical, as if my very cells had recognized something that commanded stillness, that demanded witness. The being's movements carried an intention I could feel more than see, a purpose that radiated from it in waves that pressed against my skin, my chest, the inside of my skull, where thoughts were forming and dissolving too quickly to grasp. There was no aggression in its approach, no predatory hunger, but rather something that felt almost ceremonial, ritualistic, as though we were both participants in an ancient script neither of us had written. As it drew closer, I began to perceive details that my eyes couldn't quite hold, patterns in what might have been skin, or might have been something else entirely, geometries that seemed to shift whenever I tried to focus directly on them, arrangements that suggested meaning in a language built from shapes instead of sounds. The air between us grew thick, charged with a presence that made the hair on my arms stand upright, that created pressure changes in the cab of the truck, as if reality itself was bending to accommodate this being's proximity to my mundane metal and glass sanctuary. I realized I was holding my breath, had been holding it for impossible lengths of time without consequence, as if normal biological needs had been suspended for the duration of this encounter. Part of me understood that I should be terrified, should be experiencing the kind of existential horror that shatters minds. But instead, I felt a strange calm settling over me, acceptance mixed with awe, the sensation of standing before something so far beyond my comprehension that fear became irrelevant, replaced by a kind of religious wonder I'd never experienced in any church or holy place. Then it happened, the connection that changed everything, that redefined what I understood consciousness could be. The creature's gaze intensified, those impossible eyes fixing on mine with sudden focus, and I felt something open inside my head, not painfully, but with the shock of a door I didn't know existed suddenly swinging wide to reveal rooms I'd been living alongside without awareness. Images flooded in, not visual in the way human sight works, but direct, immediate, bypassing the need for interpretation. Vast stretches of empty land, before roads existed, before humans walked here, when the earth was younger and the barriers between worlds were thinner, more permeable. I saw this being and others like it moving through those ancient spaces, not as visitors, but as residents, as fundamental to the landscape as the rocks and rivers, woven into the fabric of the wild places with threads that went deeper than ecology, deeper than biology, into the realm where matter and meaning become indistinguishable. There was no language to this communication, no words or grammar, just pure transmission of experience and knowledge, feeling and memory pouring from its consciousness into mine like water finding its level. I understood somehow that these beings had watched humanity emerge, had observed our spread across the continents, our transformation of wilderness into civilization, our paving over of the old ways and old paths. They had retreated not from fear, but from something else, discretion perhaps, or ancient agreement, or simply because the frequencies we broadcast with our technology and our noise made it painful for them to remain in proximity to our settled places. But they hadn't vanished entirely, hadn't abandoned this world that was theirs long before it was ours, and in certain forgotten spaces, along certain roads that appeared only when the conditions aligned, the boundary between their realm and ours grew thin enough to cross. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on me, reshaping my understanding of reality with the force of tectonic plates shifting, creating new landscapes in my mind that could never be unmade. I felt the loneliness of these beings, immortal or near immortal, watching world after world of ephemeral creatures rise and fall while they endured, unchanged and unchanging, guardians of thresholds that most humans no longer believed existed. There was sadness in what it showed me, but also something like hope, the recognition that occasionally a human consciousness proved capable of perceiving them, of surviving the encounter with sanity intact, of carrying forward the knowledge that the world is vaster and stranger than our cities and highways suggest. I understood that I had been tested somehow, measured during those 20 miles of glitching GPS and impossible roads, and found suitable for this revelation, this moment of contact between species, if species was even the right word for what this being was. Tears were streaming down my face without my awareness, my body responding to emotions too large for my nervous system to process normally, overflow finding release through whatever channels it could access. The creature seemed to recognize my understanding, to sense the transformation happening in my consciousness, and something that might have been approval or satisfaction or recognition passed between us, wordless and absolute. In that moment I felt connected, not just to this singular being, but to the entire hidden world it represented, the vast ecology of mystery that exists parallel to human civilization, invisible to those who haven't been shown how to see it, but always present, always watching, always waiting. The being raised one elongated limb, the movement deliberate and formal, and reached toward the windshield that separated us, that thin barrier of glass that suddenly seemed as insubstantial as tissue paper, as meaningless as any human-made division between inside and outside, safe and dangerous, known and unknown. Its hand, for lack of a better word, though the appendage was like no hand evolution had designed for, grasping or manipulating, pressed against the glass, and I watched with detached fascination as the surface beneath its touch began to glow, faint light tracing patterns that burned themselves into the molecular structure of the windshield, creating a symbol that was simultaneously simple and infinitely complex, a design that hurt to look at, directly because it seemed to contain more information than my visual cortex could process. The light intensified for a heartbeat, bright enough that I should have looked away, but couldn't, wouldn't, sensing that this was the culmination of the encounter, the purpose toward which everything had been building. Then it faded to a barely perceptible shimmer, a mark visible only to me, only to eyes that had been opened by this contact with the impossible. The being stepped back, or perhaps simply ceased to be proximate. distance reasserting itself between us with the same strange fluidity that had characterized all its movements. I felt the connection in my mind beginning to close, not severed, but gently separated, like hands releasing after a long embrace. And with that separation came the return of ordinary time, ordinary physics, ordinary reality, flooding back into the spaces that had been held open for this extraordinary communion. The being remained there before me, motionless, yet somehow vibrating with presence, and I became aware of something extraordinary happening in the silence between us, a language being born that had nothing to do with words or sounds, but existed purely in the realm of recognition, consciousness speaking directly to consciousness across the vast evolutionary distance that separated our species. I could feel it observing me with an intensity that went beyond mere visual assessment, perceiving not just my physical form, but the electromagnetic patterns of my thoughts, the chemical symphony of my emotions, the accumulated weight of every experience that had shaped the person sitting frozen in this truck cab at the edge of impossible reality. There was curiosity in its attention, genuine interest. Rather than cold clinical examination, as if encountering a human willing and able to perceive it without fleeing or collapsing into madness, was rare enough to warrant this extended contact, this careful mutual exploration. Through the connection still humming in my mind, I began to sense fragments of what it experienced, the texture of existing. Outside linear time, the sensation of perceiving multiple dimensions simultaneously, the profound isolation of being one of the last guardians of thresholds that humanity had forgotten existed. I realized with sudden clarity that this creature was as alone in its way as I had been during those endless night drives through America's forgotten spaces, both of us wanderers in territories that others rushed through without truly seeing, both of us intimate with the particular quality of solitude that comes from perceiving realities invisible to the majority of our respective kinds. This recognition created a bridge between us, fragile but real, built from the shared experience of existing at the margins of our worlds. And I felt something shift in the being's presence, a softening or opening that suggested I had been recognized not as prey or threat, but as something unexpected, a potential companion in witnessing, however briefly, however impossibly, the patterns on what I could only think of as its skin began to shift more, deliberately, and I understood somehow that this was intentional communication, a visual language being performed for my benefit, even though my human eyes could barely track the geometries sliding across its form, like living tattoos made of starlight and shadow. Each configuration seemed to carry emotional resonance, along with meaning, sadness, braided with determination, loneliness interwoven with purpose, the complex emotional landscape of a being that had chosen or been chosen to maintain watch over boundaries that kept realities separate and stable, even as those boundaries grew thinner with each passing century. I found myself responding not with thoughts but with feelings, opening my own emotional state to the connection between us, offering up my own loneliness and wonder, my own sense of being displaced from the ordinary human experience by too many miles driven in darkness, too many hours spent in contemplation of horizons rather than in comfortable community with my own species. The exchange that followed had the quality of mutual confession, two isolated consciousnesses acknowledging each other across an impossible divide, and in that acknowledgement finding unexpected comfort, unexpected validation. I understood that it was showing me its purpose, not to frighten or harm, but to remind, to mark certain humans with awareness so that the old knowledge wouldn't vanish completely from our species' memory, so that somewhere in the collective human consciousness would remain the understanding that mystery still exists, that wonder still waits in the forgotten places, that we are not alone and never have been. There was desperate hope in this mission, the recognition that as humanity's technology grew louder and our cities brighter. The spaces where beings like this could exist grew smaller and fewer, pushed to the absolute edges of civilization, where the roads ended and the wild darkness still held sovereignty over the land. Time continued its strange distortion as we remained locked in this communion, and I felt layers of my own, consciousness peeling back like old paint, revealing parts of myself I had buried under years of routine and resignation. The wonder I had felt as a child before the world convinced me that magic was fiction and mystery was just ignorance waiting for explanation. The creature seemed to sense this resurrection of childlike awe within me, and I felt something that might have been approval or recognition ripple through our connection, an acknowledgement that this was precisely what the encounter was meant to awaken. Not fear that would traumatize and silence me, but wonder that would sustain and transform me, that would make me a carrier of possibility back into the mundane world of highway rest. Stops and diesel fuel and conversations about weather and road conditions. I realized I was being trusted with something precious, granted a responsibility I had never sought but somehow had proven capable of bearing, and the weight of this realization settled into my bones with the permanence of truth that cannot be unlearned or forgotten. Part of me wanted to reach out, to touch the glass from my side as it had touched from its side, to complete some circuit of connection that felt incomplete, but I understood instinctively that the gesture would be wrong, that the asymmetry of our contact was intentional and necessary, that I was meant to receive rather than attempt reciprocation. So I simply sat there, tears still tracking down my weathered face. Hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, I no longer had any intention of turning, and allowed myself to be fully present to this impossible gift of encounter, this moment that existed outside the normal flow of cause and effect, this crossing of paths that both our journeys had somehow been leading toward without my awareness. When the being finally moved toward the windshield and pressed its limb against the glass, I felt the symbol burning itself into place, not just on the physical surface, but simultaneously into my consciousness, a mark that would remain visible to my inner eye even when the physical trace became too faint for ordinary perception, a reminder and a seal and a key all at once. The light that traced those impossible geometries seemed to carry compressed information, years or centuries of accumulated wisdom downloaded in an instant, too much to process consciously, but absorbed nonetheless into deeper layers of my mind, where it would unfold slowly over the remaining years of my life, revealing new dimensions of meaning as I grew capable of understanding them. I felt gratitude rising in me, overwhelming and inarticulate, not the polite social gratitude of everyday transactions, but the profound thankfulness that comes from receiving an unearned gift of immeasurable value, from being chosen for blessing rather than curse, when the opposite would have been equally possible. The creature seemed to perceive this emotion, and for just a moment, before it began to withdraw, I felt something like warmth flow back through our connection, affection of a sort I could barely comprehend but recognized as genuine, as real as anything I had ever experienced in human relationships, despite the vast differences between us. The moment the creature began to pull away from the windshield, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere between us, and what had been a communion of mutual recognition suddenly transformed into something closer to teaching, as if our connection had progressed through stages of introduction and acknowledgement into territory that required me to witness rather than simply receive. The being's form, which had maintained a relatively stable configuration throughout our exchange, began to fragment in ways that violated every law of physics I understood, its limbs multiplying and retracting simultaneously, its height collapsing and extending in rhythms that seemed synchronized to frequencies beyond my hearing, and I realized with mounting vertigo that I was being shown its true nature, the reality beneath whatever compromise form it had assumed to keep my sanity intact during initial contact. This was trust of a different magnitude, the vulnerability of allowing me to perceive it without the protective filters, and the sight burned itself into my consciousness with an intensity that bordered on pain. Beauty and horror so intertwined, they became indistinguishable. Geometry that sang with meaning my human mind could only grasp in fragments, colors that existed outside the spectrum, visible to ordinary eyes, but that I could somehow perceive now that the encounter had opened doors in my perception I hadn't known were closed. Through the connection still thrumming between us, I felt its history flooding into me, not as organized narrative, but as experiential memory. And I understood that it was among the last of its kind, a species or category of being that had once moved freely between the layers of reality when the boundaries were more permeable, when human consciousness was less fixed and concrete, when the world still contained spaces of genuine wildness where impossible things could exist without being rationalized away. I saw through its perception the slow shrinking of its territory, felt the encroachment of highways and power lines and cellular towers, each new imposition of human infrastructure creating interference patterns that made its existence more difficult, more painful, more limited, until only these forgotten backroads at the edges of populated zones offered enough silence and darkness for it to fully manifest. There was no anger in this showing, no resentment toward humanity for its relentless expansion, only a profound melancholy that reminded me of how I felt watching old highways get torn up and replaced. Those beautiful stretches of road that had connected remote communities becoming obsolete as new interstates bypassed them entirely, leaving ghost towns and abandoned gas stations as the only evidence that people had once lived and loved and built their lives in these spaces. The parallel between us deepened beyond mere loneliness now, and I recognized that we were both witnesses to extinction events unfolding in slow motion, both guardians of disappearing ways, of being that the modern world had no category or value for, and this recognition brought fresh tears, because I understood finally that the creature had chosen me not despite, but because of this shared experience of obsolescence. The being's form stabilized again, but differently now, as if it had shed some protective limitation and was showing me a configuration closer to its authentic self. And I found myself overwhelmed not by fear, but by a grief so enormous it seemed to originate from somewhere beyond my individual consciousness, a species-level mourning for everything humanity had lost in our rush toward concrete answers and quantifiable realities. I thought about the old stories my grandmother had told me before she died, tales of beings that lived in the spaces between things, entities that could only be perceived by those who hadn't yet learned to dismiss their own direct experience in favor of consensus reality. And I realized those stories hadn't been metaphors or entertainment, but actual preserved memories of encounters, like this one, passed down through generations until modernity had finally severed the chain of transmission by teaching us that such things were impossible, and therefore any experience suggesting otherwise must be delusion or fraud. The creature seemed to recognize my understanding of this cultural amnesia, this self-imposed blindness, and I felt a wave of something like desperation flow through our connection. An urgent need for me to remember and to somehow keep the memory alive, to be a carrier of this knowing back into the world that had forgotten how to see. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the full weight of what was being asked of me settled into clarity, and I realized the mark on my windshield wasn't just a sign of having been encountered, but a responsibility, a commission to bear witness to mysteries that the rational world would immediately dismiss or pathologize. I thought about returning to the truck stops and dispatch offices. Imagine trying to explain this night to other drivers who would either laugh or look at me with concern. Pictured the isolation that would deepen as I carried knowledge that couldn't be shared without being diminished or denied, and for the first time since the encounter began, I felt something close to resistance rising in me. The resistance I felt was met not with pressure or coercion, but with something infinitely more persuasive, understanding so complete it dissolved my objections before they could fully form, and I realized the creature wasn't asking me to become some kind of evangelist or prophet trying to convince skeptics of what I'd witnessed, but simply to continue living with the knowledge intact, to let it inform my choices and perceptions without demanding validation from a world that had long ago decided such experiences were impossible. Through our connection, I felt the being acknowledge my fear of isolation, my dread of being seen as unstable or delusional, and in response it offered a vision of others like me scattered across the continent and beyond, people who had encountered mysteries that couldn't be explained away, who carried their own invisible marks and private knowings through lives that appeared ordinary on the surface, but were secretly illuminated by experiences that existed outside consensus reality. I saw a network of witnesses I'd never meet, connected not by organization or communication, but by the simple fact of having touched something genuine and inexplicable, and I understood that I wouldn't be as alone as I feared, that the isolation would be real but not absolute, that there was a kind of invisible fellowship among those who had been changed by encounters with the impossible and chosen to honor the experience rather than rationalize it away. The being's presence intensified again, and I felt myself being drawn deeper into the communion, past the exchange of emotions and memories into something more fundamental, a level of connection where the boundaries between self and other became genuinely permeable rather than merely blurred, and I experienced a moment of consciousness so expanded it felt like my awareness had been lifted out of my individual body and elevated to a perspective that could perceive the entire web of relationships that constituted reality in this moment. I saw my truck as a focal point where multiple dimensions of existence were temporarily aligned, saw the road beneath as both physical asphalt and metaphysical pathway, saw the desert around us as simultaneously empty and teeming with forms of life and consciousness that operated on frequencies invisible to normal human perception, and I understood with sudden absolute clarity that what we call the physical world is only the thinnest surface layer of a reality so much deeper and stranger than our sciences and philosophies had ever suggested. The revelation didn't come as intellectual information, but as direct perception, and I knew with the certainty of lived experience that the universe was not the dead mechanism described by materialist science, but a living totality of interpenetrating consciousnesses, each form of awareness contributing to a whole that was itself aware, and that beings like the one before me were not supernatural exceptions to natural law, but natural expressions of possibilities that human civilization had simply stopped acknowledging. The perspective shift lasted only moments by clock time, but felt like an eternity of understanding condensing into the narrow channel of my human awareness. And when I returned fully to my ordinary consciousness, sitting in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel and my heart hammering against my ribs, I found I was weeping again, but differently now. Tears flowing not from fear or grief, but from something closer to reverence, the kind of overwhelming emotion I'd felt only a few times in my life, when confronted with beauty or meaning so profound it cracked through all my defenses and cynicism. I looked at the being through the windshield with new eyes, seeing simultaneously the impossible figure that would terrify anyone who encountered it without preparation, and the deeper truth beneath the form, the consciousness that was reaching across a gulf of incomprehensible difference to make contact with mine. And I felt a gratitude so intense it bordered on devotion, not worship of the creature itself, but thanksgiving for the fact of this connection, for the proof it offered that existence was so much richer and more mysterious than the narrow world I'd been taught to accept as the totality of what was real. The gratitude I felt was suddenly complicated by a new sensation flooding through our connection. urgency, sharp and insistent, cutting through the communion like an alarm bell sounding in a cathedral. I felt the being's attention shift, its focus pulling away from me. Momentarily, as if scanning for something beyond my perception, and through the link between us, I sensed what might have been concern or perhaps calculation, emotions filtering through an alien consciousness that couldn't quite translate cleanly into human feelings. The air inside my cab grew colder, and I watched as the creature's head tilted at an angle no human neck could achieve, those reflective eyes sweeping across the darkness beyond my headlights as if reading information written in the empty desert that I had no equipment to detect. Something had changed in the atmosphere of our encounter. Some variable had shifted, and I felt the being withdraw slightly from the depths of connection we'd achieved, pulling back not in rejection, but in what felt disturbingly like protection, as if shielding me from something I wasn't ready to perceive. The weight of its attention returned to me with new intensity, and I understood without words that our time was limited, that this window of contact couldn't remain open indefinitely, that there were costs and risks to this communion that I'd been mercifully unaware of until this moment. Through the link, I felt the being wrestling with some kind of decision, weighing factors I couldn't fully comprehend, and in the spillover of its deliberation, I caught fragmentary impressions of why encounters like this were rare, why beings, such as this one, didn't simply reveal themselves openly to humanity at large. I perceived glimpses of something like an ecology of consciousness, a careful balance maintained between different orders of awareness that coexisted in the same physical space, but normally operated without interference, separate dimensions of reality occupying the same location, but vibrating at frequencies that kept them functionally isolated from each other. The being showed me how contact between these layers was possible, but not without consequence. How every genuine encounter created ripples that propagated outward through multiple levels of existence, affecting systems and relationships I had no framework to understand, and I grasped that what was happening between us in this moment wasn't just personally significant, but carried implications that extended far beyond my individual experience. There were protocols being observed, boundaries being carefully negotiated, permissions being requested from authorities or forces that existed beyond both of us, and I realized with creeping awe that this creature itself was taking risks by maintaining contact with me, that it had chosen to reach across the barrier between our kinds of consciousness despite costs I couldn't fully appreciate. The revelation of risk and sacrifice intensified everything I was feeling, transforming my gratitude into something more complex and heavy with responsibility. If this being was endangering itself or violating some cosmic ordinance to make this connection with an insignificant truck driver on a forgotten road, then my response mattered in ways I was only beginning to understand, and I felt the weight of that mattering settle onto my shoulders like a physical burden. Through our link, I tried to communicate my recognition of what was being offered and what was being risked, tried to convey that I understood this wasn't casual or random, that I would honor the encounter by carrying it carefully within me, rather than cheapening it through careless disclosure or allowing the memory to be eroded by the skepticism and mockery that would inevitably greet any attempt to share what had happened. The being responded with what felt like approval, mixed with sorrow, and I sensed its awareness that it was placing a genuine burden on me, transforming me from an ordinary person living an unremarkable life into someone carrying knowledge that would separate me from consensus reality, marking me as permanently other in subtle ways that would make certain kinds of normal human connection forever difficult. It was offering me truth at the cost of comfortable belonging, expanding my understanding of reality while simultaneously exiling me from the warm certainty shared by those who had never glimpsed what lay beyond the accepted boundaries of the possible. The communion deepened once more, despite or perhaps because of the urgency I'd felt moments before, as if the being had decided that having come this far and taken these risks, it would complete what it had started, rather than leave me with partial understanding. Its presence intensified until I could barely breathe under the weight of it, and I felt myself being drawn toward one final revelation, something the creature needed me to know before our contact ended, knowledge it had traveled into my dimension of reality specifically to deliver. The being's hand rose toward my windshield, moving with that same impossible fluidity that seemed to skip frames of reality, and I watched transfixed as its fingers, too long jointed in too many places, extended toward the glass that separated us. Time contracted and expanded around that gesture, each inch of movement stretching into subjective eternity while simultaneously arriving instantly, and I felt myself suspended in a moment that existed outside normal causality, trapped in the amber of an experience that would define every moment that came after. The hand made contact with the glass, and I felt the touch not just visually, but through every cell of my body, as if the windshield were an extension of my own skin, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath crystallized in clouds that hung motionless in air that had forgotten how to move. Through our connection, I understood that this gesture was more than symbolic, that the being was anchoring something into my reality, creating a permanent marker that would serve purposes I could only partially grasp, part reminder, part protection, part calling card for entities that navigated by senses I didn't possess. Light began to emanate from where its palm pressed against the glass. Not the familiar light of my headlights or dashboard, but something else entirely. Illumination that seemed to come from sideways to normal space, carrying colors that had no names because human eyes had never been equipped to process them. The light resolved into a symbol, burning itself into the windshield with no heat but absolute permanence, a design that was simultaneously geometric and organic, mathematical and alive, shifting subtly whenever I tried to focus directly on it, as if it existed in more dimensions than my perception could fully capture. I stared at the pattern taking shape on the glass, interlocking curves that suggested both language and diagram, containing what felt like compressed information, too dense for conscious interpretation, meaning that would have to be unpacked slowly over years or perhaps lifetimes. Through our connection, the being communicated that this mark was a gift and a burden, a key and a lock, something that would serve me in ways I wouldn't understand until circumstances arose that required its presence. And I felt its certainty that such circumstances would arise, that my life from this moment forward would carry me into situations where this invisible to others symbol would function as passport or shield or recognition signal for forces that moved through the world unseen by consensus reality. The weight of that destiny settled into my bones, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was being drafted into something, volunteered without my explicit permission but not against my will, recruited for a role in systems and conflicts that operated behind the curtain of ordinary existence. The being flooded me with reassurance that I would never be entirely alone again, that the mark would connect me to resources and guardians I wouldn't perceive, but who would perceive me. And I felt gratitude and terror in equal measure at the thought of invisible protection and invisible observation, following me through every moment of the life I'd have to continue living in the world of electric bills and traffic lights, and people who believed they understood what was real. As the symbol completed itself, burning with that sideways light that hurt something deeper than my eyes, the being began to withdraw, not just its hand but its entire presence, pulling back from the depths of connection we'd achieved, like tide receding from shore. The severance of our communion was physically painful, a tearing sensation in parts of my consciousness I hadn't known existed until they were touched, and I gasped against the loss, even as part of me felt relief at the removal of that overwhelming presence from the intimate spaces of my mind. Through the fading connection, I felt the being's acknowledgement of the pain it was causing, its regret tempered by necessity, and a final pulse of complex emotion I could only interpret as something like affection or perhaps recognition of kinship, the way a teacher might regard a student showing unexpected potential, or a soldier might salute another before parting for different battlefields. The creature's form began to fade, or perhaps shift out of phase with the frequency of reality my senses could detect, its too tall silhouette becoming translucent and then simply absent, not moving away, but ceasing to intersect with the dimension I inhabited, and I was left staring at empty road where something impossible had stood moments before. The symbol remained on my windshield, glowing faintly in the darkness, and I sat trembling behind the wheel of my truck, feeling the silence of the desert crash back over me like water filling a space that had been briefly held. Empty, alone again, but fundamentally changed, marked in ways both visible and invisible, carrying knowledge that would separate me forever from the comfortable certainty I'd lived in before this night. The night air felt different now, heavier with significance, vibrating with frequencies I'd never noticed before this encounter had tuned my awareness to their presence, and I realized with dawning comprehension that the being hadn't just visited my reality, but had adjusted something in me, calibrated my perception so that I would remain slightly out of phase with consensus existence, able to detect the edges and seams of ordinary reality where other orders of being pressed against the thin places of the world. I looked at the symbol still glowing on my windshield and felt its presence resonating with something newly awakened in my chest. A corresponding mark burned not on my body, but into the fabric of whatever passed for my soul, and I understood that I had been initiated into a mystery I would spend the rest of my life exploring and never fully comprehending. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and I felt tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't have said whether they came from joy or terror or grief for the simpler person I'd been an hour ago, the man who'd believed the universe was mapped and explained and thoroughly domesticated by human understanding. That man was gone, left behind on this impossible road, and the person sitting in this truck now was someone different, someone marked and chosen and burdened with knowledge that would have to be carried carefully through a world that had no category for what I'd experienced, no vocabulary adequate to the reality I now knew existed. In the spaces between the accepted and the proven and the believed, I put the truck in gear, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, my breath still coming in ragged pulls as I tried to process what had just transpired in that impossible space between moments. The engine rumbled back to life, and the familiar vibration through the seat felt like an anchor to reality, a reminder that physics and mechanics still operated according to rules I understood, even if the wider universe had just revealed itself to be far stranger than I'd ever imagined. The road ahead looked normal now, just asphalt and painted lines stretching into darkness, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was driving through a fundamentally different world than the one I had inhabited an hour ago, that the change wasn't in the landscape, but in my ability to perceive what had always been hidden just beyond the edge of ordinary sight. As I accelerated away from that stretch of impossible road, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the being still standing there watching my departure, but there was only empty highway dissolving into the pre-dawn darkness, and the solitude felt both comforting and newly charged with awareness of how populated that emptiness might actually be. The symbol on my windshield pulsed faintly with each beat of my heart, and I understood that it was reading me. As much as I was observing it, that we were now in permanent conversation, this mark and my marked consciousness, engaged in a dialogue that would continue for the rest of my life, whether I consciously participated or not. Miles accumulated beneath my wheels, and gradually the dead zone released its grip on my GPS, coordinates and satellite. signals flooding back as if a dam had broken, routing me toward the highway and the approaching dawn and the world of truck stops and delivery schedules that suddenly seemed like an elaborate stage set, obscuring deeper truths. I reached Interstate 15 just as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber that would have looked entirely ordinary yesterday, but now seemed charged with symbolic significance, as if the light itself was communicating in the same visual language as the mark burning on my windshield. I pulled into a rest stop and stumbled out of the cab, my legs weak and uncertain, and stood breathing the cool morning air while other truckers moved through their routines, completely unaware that one of their number had just returned from an encounter that redefined the boundaries of possible experience. I approached another driver, a guy I'd seen around various stops over the years, and asked him casually if he noticed anything strange about my windshield, pointing directly at the symbol that glowed with that sideways light only I seemed able to perceive. He squinted at the glass, shook his head, mentioned I might want to clean the road dust off, and walked away, leaving me standing there with the crushing confirmation that this mark was mine alone to see and bear, a private stigmata visible only to whatever forces the being had aligned me with through that burning touch. The isolation of that moment was profound, understanding that I would never be able to fully share this experience with another human being, that any attempt to describe what happened would sound like madness or fabrication, that I would have to carry this knowledge as a secret weight pressing against the inside of my chest whenever I tried to engage in normal conversation about weather and traffic and the mundane concerns that occupied people who'd never been touched by the impossible. I bought coffee in the rest stop, sat at a plastic table surrounded by ordinary travelers, and felt the unbridgeable distance between my internal reality and their consensus world, a gulf that would only widen as time passed, and the memory refused to fade the way normal memories did, remaining instead with crystalline clarity that suggested the experience existed in a different category of consciousness than regular recollection. I completed my delivery that day, moving through the motions like a ghost inhabiting my own life. And in the weeks that followed, I tried repeatedly to convince myself that I'd hallucinated the entire encounter, that I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed something my exhausted brain had assembled from stress and isolation and too many hours on empty roads. But the symbol remained constant on my windshield, visible to my eyes in every lighting condition, and more tellingly, things began to happen that confirmed I'd been fundamentally changed by that night on the unmapped road between worlds. I found myself instinctively avoiding certain routes that my rational mind knew were faster, but that some deeper awareness recognized as dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with traffic or weather. And later, I'd hear about accidents or strange disappearances on those exact stretches at the times I would have been traveling through. Other times, I felt compelled to take unexpected detours, and invariably, these deviations would place me in position to help someone in need, a stranded family, a driver having a medical emergency, situations where my presence at that precise moment felt orchestrated by forces using the mark as a guidance system for purposes I could only partially understand. I began to notice other people who carried similar invisible markers, not the same symbol, but variations that suggested a whole taxonomy of encounters and recruitments. Other individuals who'd been touched by the impossible and drafted into service as agents or witnesses or conduits for powers that operated in the margins of consensus reality, and though we rarely spoke directly about our experiences, there was recognition in our exchanged glances, a knowing that created brief moments of connection in our otherwise isolating knowledge. Years have passed since that night, and I'm still driving these roads, still carrying the mark that burns invisible on my windshield and visible in dimensions of awareness. I'm slowly learning to navigate with something approaching competence, if not mastery. I've come to understand that the being didn't burden me with this knowledge as punishment, but offered it as invitation, a doorway into deeper participation in the extraordinary complexity that underlies ordinary existence. And while the weight of that invitation is real and sometimes overwhelming, so too is the strange gratitude I feel for having been chosen or perhaps simply noticed by forces that could easily have passed me by without acknowledgement. The loneliness of this knowing has softened over time, transformed from isolation into a kind of sacred solitude, the understanding that I carry mysteries too profound for casual conversation, but precious enough to justify the careful carrying, and I've found unexpected community among others who've been similarly marked and drafted into this invisible fellowship of witnesses. When I drive now through the 3 a.m. darkness of forgotten backroads, I no longer feel entirely alone, but instead aware of the vast populated wilderness that exists alongside human civilization, all the ancient beings and impossible creatures who were never really banished by our electric lights and paved highways, but only pushed slightly out of phase with the frequencies we're taught to perceive. The roads still stretch into mystery, and I follow them not knowing what waits in the darkness ahead, but carrying with me the certainty that some encounters change us irreversibly, that some nights redraw the maps of what we thought was real, and that being chosen by the impossible, whatever the cost, whatever the burden, is a strange and terrible and ultimately precious gift that I wouldn't surrender even if such surrender were possible, because it means I've touched something true in a world that too often mistakes comfort for truth and explanation for understanding, and that touch has marked me permanently as a traveler between worlds, a witness to wonders that have no names. I've come to understand in the decades since that night that the mark wasn't just a brand or a tracking device, but something more akin to a seed planted in the soil of my consciousness and growing slowly into an entirely new way of perceiving the layers of reality that most people move through without ever sensing their presence. The being didn't explain its purposes, because explanation would have been impossible across the vast gulf between its mode of existence and mine. But through the years of carrying this mark, I've gradually understood that I was being prepared for something, trained through small interventions and quiet guidance to serve a function I still don't fully comprehend, but feel in my bones is approaching some kind of culmination. I've met others like me, scattered across the country and the world, each carrying their own variation of the symbol and their own story of impossible encounter, and together we form a network that isn't quite organized, but operates with an organic coordination that suggests we're all responding to the same underlying pattern. Cells in a larger organism whose shape we can only guess at from our limited perspectives, sometimes in the deep watches of the night, when I'm driving through particularly isolated stretches, I feel the presence of the being again, not physically manifested, but hovering somehow just beyond the membrane of normal space, watching or perhaps guiding or simply existing in that alien way that preceded human consciousness by eons, and will likely outlast our species by equally incomprehensible spans. The gratitude I mentioned earlier has deepened into something almost like love, though not the human emotion, but rather a recognition of profound connection that transcends affection or attachment, an awareness that I've been woven into a story vastly larger than my individual life, and that this weaving, however terrifying and isolating it sometimes feels, is the most meaningful thing that has ever happened to me, or likely ever will. What I've learned most fundamentally is that the maps we are given, geographical, scientific, philosophical, are useful fictions that help us navigate certain layers of existence, but become dangerous when we mistake them for complete descriptions of what actually is, and that the unmapped roads like the one I stumbled onto that night in the dead zone are always there, existing in the spaces between our careful cartographies, waiting for those moments when our navigational certainties fail, and we become briefly open to directions plotted by entirely different systems of meaning. The being could have remained hidden from me forever, could have let me pass through that stretch of road without ever revealing itself, but it chose manifestation and contact for reasons I'll never fully understand, but have learned to trust as purposeful even in their mystery. And that choice has taught me that reality is far more generous and strange than our reduction of it to mechanical processes and random arrangements of matter would suggest. I think about all the people moving through their lives, convinced that the physical world they perceive is all there is, and I feel both pity for their impoverishment and a kind of protective understanding that perhaps most humans aren't meant to carry this knowledge, that the consensual hallucination of a purely material universe serves important psychological functions for creatures as fragile and short-lived as we are, and that those of us who've been marked are possibly being used as bridges or translators, maintaining awareness of the deeper complexities so that humanity as a whole doesn't completely lose touch with the numinous dimensions of existence. The price of this awareness is high. The isolation, the inability to unsee what you've seen, the constant low-level cognitive dissonance of moving through a society that denies the validity of your most profound experiences, but the alternative, returning to the comfortable sleepwalk of ordinary perception, has become literally unimaginable to me, as impossible as unlearning language or forgetting how to see color. On my dashboard, alongside the GPS that failed me so significantly that night and thereby saved me from remaining lost in ordinary reality, I keep a small notebook where I've started recording the encounters and impressions that accumulate during my travels. Not because I imagine anyone will believe these accounts, but because I feel compelled to witness what I'm witnessing, to honor the impossible by at least acknowledging it in language, even though language inevitably fails to capture the full dimensionality of these experiences. I've written about the other marked individuals I've met, the patterns I've observed in where and when the encounters seem to cluster, the slow education in expanded perception that the symbol has facilitated over years of carrying it, and the growing sense that something is shifting in the relationship between the human world and the older, deeper presences that we've been trained to dismiss as superstition and fantasy, as if a long separation is ending and a new era of contact is beginning, with those of us bearing these marks serving as the first wave of ambassadors or perhaps experimental subjects in a vast project whose ultimate goals remain merciful beyond my capacity to comprehend. When I write these observations, the symbol on my windshield glows more brightly, pulsing in rhythms that feel like approval or acknowledgement, and I understand that the being is reading these words through my eyes, that I am quite literally providing a window through which ancient intelligence can observe human attempts to process the unprocessable, and that my stammering efforts at documentation are themselves part of the communication it initiated when it placed its impossible hand against the glass and burned its mark into my sight. The loneliness has become not lighter, but different, transformed from the isolation of being the only one who knows into the solitude of being among the few who carry responsibilities we didn't ask for but have learned to accept as privileges despite their weight. I'm 67 now, still driving though. My body complains about the long hours, and my dispatcher keeps suggesting retirement, but I can't stop because I understand that my routes are no longer determined solely by freight and economics, but by patterns I'm tracing at the behest of forces that recruited me that night on the unmapped road and haven't released me from service because the work, whatever it actually is, remains unfinished. The mark has faded visually over the years, requiring more effort to perceive even for my trained awareness, but I feel it more strongly than ever as an internal presence, a constant companion consciousness that observes through my eyes and sometimes gently suggests directions I follow without fully understanding why, trusting that the intelligence that touched me possesses perspectives on time and space and purpose that make my limited human planning irrelevant to whatever larger choreography is unfolding. I've arranged my affairs so that when I finally die, on the road I'm certain, probably on some lonely stretch in the hours before dawn, this notebook will be found among my effects, and perhaps someone reading these accounts will recognize in them an echo of their own impossible experiences and feel less alone in their knowing, or perhaps the words will seem like the ravings of a delusional old man who drove too many miles through too much darkness and broke under the psychological pressure of profound isolation. Either way, I'll have honored my obligation to witness, to record, to maintain the knowledge that we are not alone and never have been, that the roads we travel pass through territories far stranger than our maps acknowledge, and that sometimes, if you drive far enough into the forgotten places where civilization's certainties grow thin, you'll encounter something that will shatter your understanding of what's possible and rebuild you as a different kind of being, marked and changed and permanently enlisted in mysteries that human language has no adequate words for, but that human hearts, stretched beyond their comfortable dimensions, can somehow learn to hold without breaking, can even learn to love in that strange way that transcends human categories and touches something older, something that was waiting in the darkness long before our species climbed down from the trees and started mapping the world in our own limited image, something that will still be waiting long after our civilization has crumbled and our roads have been reclaimed by the wilderness that was always more alive and aware than we ever dared to believe. Have you ever felt like something was watching you from just beyond what you can see? Subscribe to witness more encounters that exist beyond the edge of our mapped reality.